What if I told you that there is something inside your home that is blocking the presence of the sacred without you even realizing it? Carl Jung, the man who unraveled the depths of the human soul, wrote that certain objects carry symbols that not only influence our psyche, but attract shadows that feed on distraction denial and the unconscious. Especially on days dedicated to spirituality, such as Holy Sundays, he believed that the presence of the invisible becomes more intense, both for good and for evil. Now think what is inside your home right now that carries memories, intentions, or symbols that no longer belong to the light. What rests on your shelves or walls that could be suffocating the subtle breath of the divine. Don't underestimate the power of objects. They are mirrors of the soul, and also portals. Today you will discover which ones should be removed. But first, look around you. Because what inhabits your home may not be yours alone. Carl Jung understood environments as extensions of the soul. He said that the psyche projects into physical space what it has not yet been able to integrate internally. Therefore, the objects around us are not neutral. They carry psychic energy, archetypal memories, and unconscious intentions. When an environment is saturated with symbols that have not been consciously chosen, a resonance field is created where shadows easily settle. And according to Jung, this shadow is not just a psychological concept, it is a presence, a kind of spiritual density that silently contaminates the emotional and spiritual field of the people who live there. In his diaries, Jung recounted disturbing experiences in seemingly normal homes, houses where everyone fell ill for no apparent reason, where insomnia reigned, where conflicts seemed to spring from nowhere. He realized that in these spaces there was always something in common: forgotten objects, misunderstood symbols, traces of energies that had not been purified. Jung did not call them cursed, but rather psychic condensers, elements that amplify certain emotional and spiritual frequencies. He warned that on days considered sacred, such as Sunday, a day when consciousness opens to transcendence, these objects act as blockages, preventing light from fully penetrating. He recounted, for example, the case of a woman who sought him out in the midst of an existential crisis. She felt depressed every Sunday. During the week, she managed to maintain a functional appearance, but as soon as the Sunday silence set in, she was overcome by a deep emptiness. Jung did not attribute this solely to the natural melancholy that affects many people on weekends. He asked to visit her home, and there, without saying a word, he just observed. In her living room, there was a makeshift altar with religious images mixed with Eastern symbols, esoteric stones, old photos of deceased family members who had suffered, and even a broken mirror. Jung did not judge. He simply asked her to try and experiment to remove all the objects for 3 days, without throwing them away, just moving them away from the central spaces. On the first Sunday morning without the objects, she reported a lightness she had not felt in years. And then he explained each of those elements carried dissonant symbolic charges. They created an invisible noise, a silent noise that blocked the presence of the sacred. What seemed like simple decoration was in fact an overlap of contradictory spiritual languages, generating a field of spiritual tension. For Jung, Sunday is the day of symbolic return to the origin, to the center. It is a day of pause that should reconnect us to our inner axis, to the self, that which is deepest and truest in us. But if the space where we live is occupied by elements that evoke vanity, rebellion, pride, control, or unresolved longing, then this reconnection does not happen. And what remains is emptiness. Or worse, the illusion of a spirituality that does not touch the soul, but only simulates comfort. Jung wrote that the shadow loves to hide behind good intentions. That is why many of the most dangerous objects for the soul are not those that frighten us, but those that falsely reassure us. A misunderstood image, an amulet inherited from a relative who never believed in anything a book read for fashion and never questioned a song repeated out of habit and not out of inspiration. All of this for him was fertile ground for what he called symbolic deviation, when the soul believes it is opening itself to the divine, but is only spinning in circles within its own inner labyrinth. And then he asks us with the silence of his writings, what images inhabit your space? What sounds play on your walls? What symbols do you allow to tell the story of your home? Because according to Jung, if the external space is in dissonance with the soul, peace cannot find a place to rest. And on Holy Sundays, this intensifies. For the collective unconscious opens up the veil between the world's thins, and what has not been purified is revealed. But Jung was not a fatalist. He believed that consciousness has the power to transform any symbolic field. It was enough to observe with sincerity, remove with intention, consecrate with truth. What was contaminated can be cleansed. What was forgotten can be redeemed. What was dissonant can be reintegrated. And that is exactly why we will delve deeper into this teaching in the next few moments, because Jung did not just point out the problem. He revealed in detail what needed to be removed, so that the shadow could leave and the sacred could return to dwell with us. Jung taught that what is not seen with the eyes of the soul tends to manifest itself destructively in matter. And when he spoke of spiritually charged homes, he was not referring only to an abstract feeling of discomfort. He saw real symptoms, chronic fatigue, disturbing dreams, inexplicable crises among family members, illnesses that seemed to drag on without apparent medical cause. For him, all of this was the consequence of a poorly constructed symbolic field, or, worse, neglected. The home, he said, is a reflection of the soul. And just as the soul needs confession prayer and silence to purify itself, the home also needs vigilance, detachment, and consecration. It was with this perspective that he began to study the symbols present in everyday objects. Jung believed that many so-called decorative or neutral elements carry fragments of unconscious narratives. A poster on the wall, a song played on, repeat a sculpture received as a gift, a stone bought without discernment. None of this is exempt. Everything speaks, everything communicates. And when these voices are discordant with our inner center, they create noise. This spiritual noise, he moam, said, deafens the soul. And on Sundays dedicated to reconnecting with the sacred, this noise can prevent grace from entering. It can transform the day most open to the divine into just another empty Sunday of disconnection and distraction. For Jung, there were 3 categories of objects that most intensely attract this shadow: those linked to fragmented spiritual practices, those that exalt the ego in its most disguised forms, and those that bring the energy of ancestors who have not found peace. He did not suggest that these objects should be feared, but that they should be observed with complete honesty. Astrology, for example, was seen by him not as evil in itself, but as an incomplete symbolic system when used to replace direct connection with the deep unconscious. Jung warned that in homes where astrological symbols gain ritualistic space, there is a risk of confusing archetype with destiny, and thus losing spiritual decision-making power. Music and sounds also occupied a special place in his studies. For him, what we hear repeatedly shapes the emotional field of the home. Songs that glorify narcissism, sensuality, violence, control, even if they have engaging beats, create an emotional field that is hostile to the subtle. Jung said that the sacred does not enter where the ego reigns, and that it is impossible to invoke light with the mouth while the ears are bathed in darkness. This contradiction, when maintained for too long, creates cracks in the symbolic field of the home, and according to him, it is through these cracks that the shadow enters. Another sensitive point in his studies was the incorrect use of religious symbols. Images of saints, crucifixes, rosaries hanging on walls, scapulars forgotten in drawers. When devoid of meaning and prayer, they become not instruments of faith, but empty memories. Jung believed that a dead symbol attracts a very specific type of energy, that of the illusion of presence. It's like keeping a picture of a loved one and never talking about them, never honoring them. The picture becomes a reminder of their absence. And spiritually, this can cause the symbol to become a burden instead of a source of light. Finally, he warned about inherited objects, items passed down from generation to generation that instead of transmitting blessings, carry memories of pain, repression, or spiritual rebellion. A ring from someone who died in denial, a book written in anger against faith, a piece of jewelry used in occult practices. Jung saw these objects as carriers of unresolved symbolic fields. He said that by keeping them in our homes out of attachment, we are also perpetuating the pain they represent. Instead of honoring our ancestors with light, we are feeding their unresolved knots. He did not propose burning everything out of fear, but rather looking at each object with courage. And upon recognizing its burden, making a conscious choice to keep transform or release. because each item removed with intention makes room for the presence of the sacred to manifest more clearly. For Jung, this was the true alchemy of the home, replacing symbols that vibrate in the shadows with elements that reverberate silence, peace, and openness to mystery. And you so far, have you felt that something inside your home has already begun to move? That some memory has surfaced, that some specific image has come to mind? Write in the comments what you have noticed so far. Perhaps your simple sharing is the beginning of the purification of another home. Perhaps your words will help someone who has not yet seen what is right before their eyes. Jung believed that every awareness, no matter how small, reverberates in the collective unconscious. So say what you feel, because the shadow dissolves in the light of shared truth. Carl Jung always insisted that symbols speak louder than words, and that the home as a physical structure is also a living language. Every object in it, every corner where silence or noise rests, every unconscious repeated gesture is a sentence written in the invisible narrative of the soul. And that narrative, when not revised, becomes a prison. Jung observed that much of the suffering that plagued his patients did not originate solely from individual traumas or emotional conflicts, but from spaces laden with unquestioned meanings, inherited from generations or absorbed from culture without reflection. These spaces became extensions of the shadow, and on sacred Sundays they became true barriers to the presence of the divine. That is why he believed that purifying the home was a psychic act as important as examining one's conscience. It was not enough to confess one's sins before an altar if upon returning home the environment remained impregnated with symbols that perpetuated the same patterns. Jung observed that many tried to find peace through prayer, but prayed surrounded by objects that evoked exactly what they wanted to overcome: fear, vanity, the illusion of control, the search for external answers instead of diving inward. He said, "The house in which one lives should reflect the deep self, not social masks, stagnant traditions, or the desires of the ego." This is how he developed a silent, almost ritualistic method that he proposed to his most sensitive patients. To walk through the house in a meditative state without haste, and look at each item as if it had a voice. "What are you saying to me?" was the question he taught them to ask, because Jung knew that objects respond, not with words, but with sensations, a heaviness in the stomach, an uncomfortable memory, a subtle uneasiness. If when you touch an object, you feel tension instead of peace, it needs to be investigated and possibly removed. That was the essence of his warning for Sundays. For him, that day carries an ancient archetype, that of sacred rest, the return to the center, the silence where God whispers. And this silence cannot coexist with chaotic symbols, conflicting messages, noises that pierce the walls in the form of vulgar music televisions, screaming vanity, or paintings that emit aggression even when disguised as art. Jung said that the sacred is shy. It does not force its way in. If it finds closed doors, it passes by. And when those doors are blocked by symbols that vibrate out of harmony with the spirit, the sacred withdraws, not out of revenge, but out of respect. Among his most touching stories, he tells of a man who, after years of spiritual confusion, decided to follow this method. As he made his way through the house, he felt that an old mirror bothered him. It was an inheritance from an uncle with whom he had had a difficult relationship. He had never paid attention to it. He just kept the mirror there as decoration. But that Sunday, as he looked at himself honestly in the mirror, he felt a contained anger, a silent judgment, a presence. And then he understood that object was a portal, a reflection of what he had buried, but which still inhabited his emotional field. When he removed the mirror, the atmosphere in the room changed. His breathing eased. The arguments at home ceased for weeks. None of this was a coincidence. Jung did not promise miracles. He was not an esoteric healer. He was a scientist of the soul. But he knew that spirituality begins in matter, in what we touch, what we see, what we allow to inhabit the spaces where we sleep, pray, and eat. And that is why he was radical in saying that a symbol out of place can make us as sick as a curse word, and that purifying the home should be a regular practice, especially on Sundays when the soul is most receptive. This purification does not have to be a rigid ritual. For Jung, sincere intention was enough. Remove with love, with gratitude, with forgiveness. Bless what is leaving, Give thanks for what served you in the past, and allow the empty space to be filled with luminous invisibility, because it is in this intentional emptiness that the spirit moves freely. Perhaps throughout this journey, you have already identified some of these objects in your home. Perhaps you have felt the urge to get up and start cleaning. Perhaps you cried when you remembered something that had been forgotten. This is not weakness. It is the beginning of reintegration. And what Jung wanted most was for each soul to find its way back to its center, that each home would become a mirror of the self. Clean, quiet, livable. Carl Jung said that every reunion with the sacred requires a break with what no longer serves us. And this break is not made with violence, but with lucidity. It happens when we have the courage to see and to act on what we see. There is no true transformation without renunciation. There is no spiritual rebirth without first a symbolic death, the death of illusion, of accumulation, of that which once had meaning but now blocks the passage of grace. The home for Jung is a spiritual body. Every object in it is a symbolic organ. And when something there is contaminated, the whole body silently falls ill. That is why he saw Sundays as sacred opportunities, moments when the veil between the visible and the invisible becomes thinner, allowing the spirit to touch matter more intensely. But for this touch to occur, the space must be prepared. It needs to say, "I am ready." And how do you do that? Not with words, but with gestures. Gestures that purify, that liberate that welcome. The simple decision to open a drawer to remove an image that no longer carries life, to delete a song that brings dense vibrations, is an act of faith. Small on the physical plane, immense on the invisible plane. Jung saw these gestures as rites of passage, silent rituals that transform an ordinary home into a sanctuary. And that is exactly what he invites us to do: transform the place where we live into a space where the sacred not only visits, but dwells. This does not require luxury theological knowledge or complicated practices. It requires an open heart and an environment that resonates with that heart. When there is coherence between the inner and outer worlds, the soul rests, and the sacred manifests itself. He said that shadows always find shelter in neglected corners, in forgotten objects inherited without reflection, kept out of fear or guilt, and that only the light of consciousness is capable of dissolving these shadows. That is why he recommended that once a week, or at least once a month, spaces be revisited with loving attention. What still vibrates with light? What no longer resonates? What is there out of inertia, attachment, or lack of choice? These questions asked honestly are more powerful than many memorized prayers, because they set the soul in motion and movement. For Jung is the language of life. You don't need to rush. The home like the soul reveals itself little by little, but you need to start. One object at a time, one memory at a time, one conscious choice at a time. And with each gesture, you will feel something change. First in the air, then in your body, then in your relationships, and finally in prayer. Because when the house is clean, prayer gains depth. When the environment is freed, the soul finds space to breathe. Jung believed that there are moments in life when the invisible calls us more strongly, when something inside us whispers, "Now. Now is the time to make space. Now is the time to let go. Now is the time to prepare the way for what is ready to arrive." This call does not come with shouting. It comes with a subtle restlessness, with a slight discomfort, with an inexplicable desire to change something that has always been there. If you are feeling this now, then you have already begun. You are already in the process, and there is no turning back. There is only the path. On this sacred Sunday, or the next moment when silence touches your heart, may you find the courage to look around with new eyes. May you listen to what your home has to say. May you honor what needs to be honored and release what needs to go. May you transform every room into a dwelling place of peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything has been purified with truth. And where there is truth, the sacred remains. If this video touched your soul, if it awakened something that was dormant, then share it with those who also need to hear it. Sometimes a simple word comes like a light in the darkness of another home. And as Jung said, every authentic movement of the soul echoes in the collective. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and continue with us on this journey of spiritual reconnection, because there is still much to be revealed. And as long as there is sincere seeking, there will be a path. May your home be a mirror of your spirit, and may both become places where the divine desires to dwell.